Hi everyone, and thanks for attending the 2021 Sunstone Symposium. This is session number 323, and it's titled, Both Mormons and Ex-Mormons Love Virginia Sorensen. But who is she? By me. The audio for this session is going to be available for purchase at sunstone.org after the symposium. If you're attending in person, remember to shop Handcrafters Row, the Benchmark bookstore, and to grab your ticket for the registration for the closing picnic. Now at Sunstone, it's our goal to build a community that allows many ways for people to express their faith. That's why our tagline is, "There's more than one way to Mormon." So we invite you to help us build a community where all paths are given space to be better understood. And if you would please support us in our mission by making a donation at sunstone.org or at the registration desk, we would be eternally grateful. About this presentation, Virginia Sorensen published novels during the 1940s through the 1960s that made the New York Times bestseller list, and they were about Mormons. But despite how old they are, these novels seem to be speaking directly to today's Mormons and ex-Mormons. This session will introduce you to your new favorite author, but good luck finding her books. It's going to be presented by me, Stephen Carter. I'm the Director of Publications for the Sunstone Education Foundation and one of the hosts for the Sunstone podcast. I'm also the recipient of 3 Association for Mormon Letters Awards, one in the essay, one in the graphic novel, and one in the anthology category. I'm kind of weird that way. So because this session was pre-recorded, there will be no in-person Q&A session. Instead, if you'd please type your question into the Whova app, I will definitely get back to you and give you probably more information than you ever wanted to know about Virginia Sorensen. So, what do you say? Shall we start? It's likely that I now have about 30 seconds to convince you that you want to stay here instead of going to the Mormon Zombie Strippers panel. Why in the world would you be interested in a novelist who published during the 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s? I mean, what relevance could she possibly have in your life? I'm going to tell you in one sentence, though it does have a semicolon in it, so I'm kind of cheating, but here it is. If you're a Mormon, you will love Virginia Sorensen's novels. If you're an ex-Mormon, you will love Virginia Sorensen's novels. And both of those can be true at the same time. See, even though her novels were published 3 generations ago, they're more relevant to contemporary Mormons and ex-Mormons than anything being written today. I'd even say it's more relevant than TikTok. But how could a woman who was born in 1912, writing about Latter-day Saints in Utah and Denmark, speak so presciently to the peculiar thoughts and emotions and struggles of Mormons and ex-Mormons in the internet age? A lot of it actually has to do with the time period that she lived in, which amazingly was a lot like the time period adults today grew up in. So let me show you how this works. Virginia was born in Provo, Utah, only 1 year after the first railroad station in Provo was completed. And soon she moved with her family to Manti, Utah, and then for high school she moved to American Fork. So her childhood was spent in these small, tight-knit Mormon communities that were just becoming connected with the outside world. Now this may sound very familiar to you because most of today's Latter-day Saint adults, i.e. us, grew up in a tight-knit ward community that functioned a lot like Sorensen's small Mormon towns, where very little of the outside world intruded. And it provided, kind of an idyllic, sheltered space. But during Virginia's early years, the outside world was starting to impinge on Utah and Mormonism. So the railroad, which actually Virginia's father worked for, it had introduced a new connection to the outside world, and by the time Virginia actually went to college, she was able to travel to Missouri on the train to spend a year training in journalism. And then, after she got married to Frederick Sorensen, she launched on a 25-year tour of America as she moved with him from college to college. So Virginia's world suddenly and irrevocably grew from provincial to national. And so did ours. Because, we had television, we had cars, we had airplanes and books and magazines and newspapers all while we were growing up. But our religious worldview, from which we derived our identity, was carefully curated by the Correlation Committee during the 1960s by the LDS Church. And so, while we were growing up, basically all the correct information had been identified, and it was fed to us constantly. So the boundaries of the church didn't look like boundaries to us. They looked like, either the end of the world or protective walls. But then the internet came, and suddenly we had access to vast stores of information, both about the world and about Mormonism. And the LDS Church's boundaries suddenly started to look a little restrictive, maybe even a little deceitful. And now they were really easy to penetrate. And when we came out the other side, we found out that the Mormon fortress was a tiny part of a world that was much bigger than we ever thought possible. And for a lot of us, this sudden connection with the rest of the world threw us into what is now called a faith crisis. So interestingly, Virginia Sorensen's first novel, A Little Lower Than the Angels, ding! This is the second printing, but it's pretty cool that I got one with a dust cover. It's hard to do. So anyway, Sorensen's first novel, A Little Lower Than the Angels, actually looks a lot like the beginnings of many Mormon faith crises, because it takes place in the LDS Church's Nauvoo period, and it presents a very messy and complex version of Mormon history, much more complex and messy than, the whitewashed one that we grew up with. Now, where did Virginia Sorensen get this information? Strangely enough, she got it from her own research in Nauvoo. In fact, she wrote a lot of the novel in the Nauvoo house, which was a hotel, which is still standing, and its construction was launched by one of Joseph Smith's revelations. And, incidentally, it was one of the hiding places of Joseph and Hiram Smith's body after the martyrdom. And Emma Smith died there. So you could say that Virginia Sorensen went through her own faith crisis, the same kind that is resulting in such a huge outmigration from the LDS Church for the past few decades. But Sorensen had something that most of today's Mormons don't have. And that thing was having one foot inside and one foot outside of the LDS Church. See, Virginia's maternal grandmother had actually left the church some years before Virginia's birth, which allowed Virginia's mother the latitude to gravitate toward Christian Science. Meanwhile, Virginia's father described himself as a Jack Mormon, so, nominally a member of the church, but not very active. However, Virginia herself was baptized a Mormon, and she was actually quite devout throughout her youth. She even went to BYU and got married in the temple. So, when Virginia encountered the complexities of Mormon history, even when she encountered the complexities of the wider world, they didn't seem to threaten her worldview and identity. Because, she had an apostate grandmother, a Christian Science mother, and a Jack Mormon father, all of whom she loved and admired. So she could approach these new complexities less as attacks on her soul and more as a new world to explore. So instead of following the lead of previous Mormon writers who defended Zion at all costs, or anti-Mormons who worked to warn the world of the Mormon menace, she actually became sort of an ethnographic novelist of Mormonism, presenting a detailed view of the lives and struggles of her people that only an insider/outsider could do. So, what is it about these novels that can make them appeal so much to current Mormons and ex-Mormons? It's the intimate way she presents both her Orthodox and her unorthodox characters. When you read her novels, you see that the believing Mormon is treated with as much poetry as the ex-Mormon. Orthodox readers find themselves tenderly portrayed. I would even say that they even come to understand things about themselves and about their faith that they had never known before. And meanwhile, the ex-Mormon readers are likely to experience a nostalgia for their lost faith, but they'll also become more appreciative of the extraordinary world that they've discovered beyond Mormonism, and also what they've been able to make of themselves since then. In fact, let me give you a few examples. What do you say? The first one is from her second novel, which is called On This Star. Got the dust cover, not bad. Let's see. This novel is about a character named Eric Erickson. He's a budding concert pianist who has left the church, and he has returned to his Mormon hometown, which was based on Manti, Utah, for an annual visit to his family. And in this particular part of the book, he's playing the organ at a church service. And it says, quote, "It sometimes frightened him to feel himself being gradually sucked into the old life. First at home, where his mother kept his room as it always had been, even to his old skis and fishing tackle. And then here, where he played the piano and the organ almost since the beginning of his remembrance. Yet, actually on the stool, and feeling the keys, and hearing the singing behind him, he always felt a rightness within himself, a sort of stay against confused loneliness. Nevertheless, he would go away in September and would suffer the old splitting all over again, a coming apart within himself that nothing seemed to heal entirely. Always, while his train found its way out of the mountains, he felt this painful breaking away, and always he resolved not to let the old tightening happen this time." That's the end of that quote. So one of my favorite parts of On This Star is Virginia's description of temple ceremonies. For example, let me read to you what she writes about the initiation ceremony. Quote, "Chell remembered the hands of the women touching her body with reverence and respect through the openings of the robe, touching those places where the holy marks would lie. As the water touched her and the holy oil, there were words of obedience, faith, virtue, recited rapidly like an incantation," unquote. And then she writes a little about the sealing, sealing. Quote, "It was a long ceremony. Marriage here had nothing to do with brevity. No matter the anxious, the amorous, the weary, this was eternity, and no less than many hours would contain its symbol," unquote. And then there's this passage from her short story called The Apostate, which was included in her collection where nothing is long ago, and it gives us the thoughts of a young character as she listens to Mormon history stories in Sunday school. Quote, "Why should I not thrill to every tale? I was a saint myself, baptized in the White Temple up on Temple Hill. I had been promised many blessings if I remained faithful. Carol and I often carried our lunches up Temple Hill and sat on the grass looking at the towers and battlements of that building like a castle. We knew what was inside. We had climbed, the day we were baptized, up one of the winding stairways to a tower and looked out together, all set apart as we were, over the valley. Someday, we said in whispers, we would be married in that holy place." Unquote. But then, to move us over into the more apostate area of the world, there is Kate Black, the protagonist of The Evening and the Morning. Sadly, I do not have a cover with a dust jacket. This is the signature reprint. As I have found out, there is not a single original edition of this book available on the internet. I thought I found one at Eborn Books, but no. They wrote back to me later and said it was not actually there. So the only thing you can find is the signature reprint. Thank you, signature. So anyway, Kate Black, the protagonist of The Evening and the Morning. She's an aging woman who, like Eric, has left the church and has returned to visit her Mormon hometown. And as she remembers her past life in that place, she reflects, quote, "If you were a woman and rebel, the only thing you could tear to pieces was your own life. So you turned upon yourself. There was no institution you could rend except at the place where it touched you. And so, always, you were the thing to be cut apart. You struck where church tied you close with obligations, duties, terrors, the promise of blessedness. You struck where family held your arms pinned, where a house, like every successive child, bound with its constant dirtying, and you struck the thing that tied you most mercilessly, the very longing that took hold of your body in the night and sometimes made you feel beautiful and assuaged, but in the morning had left you with a fresh burden which did not diminish, but grew for the rest of your days." Unquote. But then, Kate also starts perceiving some of the beauty Mormonism has for its young men. For example, when she reflects, quote, "It occurred to her that she had never before perceived this aspect of the missionary system. Just as the restlessness set in, the young men were given new places, new work, a sea voyage, and the responsibility of men and a feeling of being a part of the world and involved in bettering it, the good old dream of the young. But in this case, tied firmly to old things. So the wanderers dragged their heavy roots with them and returned to seek them securely again into familiar earth." Unquote. Now, Virginia wrote 9 novels for adults and 7 novels for children. Which of them are the ones that speak the most deeply to current Mormons and ex-Mormons? I'm going to introduce you to 4 of them. The first is Sorensen's first novel. You might as well look at the cover again. Ding! A little lower than the angels. It's a historical novel. It takes place in Nauvoo during the months leading up to Joseph Smith's martyrdom. And though it has a lot of characters in it, including a lot of people you may have heard of, like Emma Smith, Joseph Smith, Eliza Snow, Brigham Young, it focuses mostly on Mercy and Simon Baker. They're a family, a fictional family. They're new converts that have traveled from New York to Nauvoo. And like I said earlier, this is not your grandfather's whitewashed history. We watch as Eliza Snow wrestles with the tension between her attraction to Joseph Smith and her friendship with Emma Smith. We see Joseph Smith being prophetic, soppily in love, full of himself, and brave. We watch what happens when Simon Baker takes on a new wife. A wife that both saves Mercy's life and wrenches their family apart. It's quite an epic book, and it received a lot of praise from the critics when it came out. And it also sold quite well. So then, there's also On This Star, ding, with this soppy little cover. It looks like a romance novel. It kind of is a romance novel, but like I described earlier, the budding concert pianist, Eric Erickson, returns to his Mormon hometown in the 1930s, and there he and Chell, his brother's fiancée, fall in love over the course of a summer. And it's one of my favorite books partially because of how deeply it can remind you from the inside out what it's like to fall in love. It's also one of my favorite books because of how keenly it depicts both the beauties and the drawbacks of Mormonism. When you go through a faith crisis, you kind of feel like half of your life has been cut away. But in this book, somehow, Virginia's able to give you both halves of your life back again. Now, the evening and the morning, Mormons have a difficult time approving of this book. And after all, it is the story of a woman, Kate Black, who unrepentantly carries on a long-term affair in a small Mormon town, and she's presented sympathetically. This doesn't sit well with Orthodox Mormons. It looks too much like, maybe even exactly like, an attempt at making wickedness look like happiness. But Virginia is somehow able to help you understand both the nourishing and the destructive aspects of the affair, as well as the nourishing and destructive aspects of Mormonism and its followers. She hasn't brought you to this story to judge anyone, which is astonishing, but rather to experience the characters as people. And it has, by far, the most satisfying ending of any of Virginia's books. But notice that I didn't say it was a happy ending. Finally, there is Many Heavens. Once again, you get to see the dust jacket, which Virginia said she liked, but didn't look a thing like Cache Valley. What do you say? Anyway, Many Heavens. This one has the most gripping story of the 4 books. It's a historical novel. It's set just after the Woodruff Manifesto in Cache Valley, Utah. Zina, who's the protagonist, has been taking care of Meddy, the invalid wife of the local doctor, whose name is Niels. He went to Europe on his mission, and he stayed there to get a medical degree before he returned to the valley. So she develops a friendship with Meddy and falls in love with Niels. What follows is a love story that is simultaneously thrilling and heartbreaking. It's thrilling because, again, Virginia knows how to make you fall in love. But it's heartbreaking because this love has deep consequences for everyone involved. The dramatic tension between the romance and honoring each human soul is astonishing. And the plot pulls no punches. There's a part toward the end of the book that I promise will make your jaw drop open. Plus, you get to learn about the role medical women played in early Utah, which is quite fascinating. This is the book where Virginia perfects everything that she had been working on for the past 3 books, testing Mormonism and secularism to their limits, and finally finding out where they meet. There is one more Mormon novel, but it doesn't really belong in the category of books I've been talking about here. It's called Kingdom Come, another dust jacket. And it's about how some people in 1850s Denmark convert to the Mormon church. And it's an interesting book. Virginia spent 6 months in Denmark researching it, but 99% of it could have been published by Deseret Book. It's pretty much a straightforward conversion story. In fact, when she was writing it, Virginia said that her motivation to write the book was, quote, "the desire to tell the story I heard so often in testimony meeting when I was a child, in that unforgettably delightful Danish accent." So none of her usual juggling of belief and doubt happens here. However, she wrote it as the beginning of a trilogy, and from her notes and her letters, it looks like the second 2 installments would be much more along the lines of these other novels. She was getting ready to get everything really complicated. Sadly, she never wrote these books. Anyway, as you can see, Virginia Sorensen's novels are very different from what you would expect Mormon novels written in the 1940s through the 1960s to be like. For one thing, they're not afraid of sexuality. But the real difference between our normal conception of Mormon literature and Virginia's novels is kind of like the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So the Old Testament is about how this peculiar people establishes itself in the world. And to do such a thing, you need judgment. You need to judge how your people behave, how they think, what they value, what they should sacrifice for. And so the Book of Mormon is largely an Old Testament style book. Its characters are punished and rewarded according to their beliefs and actions. They are the pawns of the story, being pushed along toward either redemption or destruction, depending on what it is that they're doing, following the theme's invisible course. So if the Old Testament is about God judging the people, then the New Testament is about God's mercy. So just as the central theme of the 4 Gospels and Paul's writing is that God's great miracle was coming into atonement with the rest of creation, so it is with Sorensen's Mormon novels. An excellent metaphor for this shift between the Old and the New Testament, Old and New Testament style literature, is the New Testament story of the woman who was caught in adultery. So the Orthodox members of Jesus' community bring a woman who has clearly broken their law to ascertain Jesus' judgment of her. But instead of casting judgment, Jesus replies, "Let he who is sinless cast the first stone," pushing these accusers to look within themselves so that they can see the piece of themselves that is much like this woman. So by eschewing judgment, he beckons the accusers and the accused toward connection. Of course, Jesus wasn't very well liked by his community. His boundaries were too permeable. He saw outsiders too empathetically, and he saw insiders too clearly. So he had this concerning habit of connecting the insider with the outsider, seeing what new thing would synthesize from that connection. So the Old Testament certainly resonated with what the Latter-day Saints were doing as they trekked into their own wilderness and established their own kingdom. But times have changed. Like the Israelites of Jesus' time, the Mormons are now faced with how to interact with a world that will not let them alone. They can't establish themselves any longer purely through power and identity. We need to learn how to connect. And the hallmark of Sorensen's writing, noted again and again by reviewers and critics, is her extraordinary ability to empathize with every one of her characters. So, though Sorensen's characters wander around the wilderness of belief, they're not lost. because they are deeply loved both by the author and soon enough by the reader. If God is anything like Virginia Sorensen, we're all going to be just fine at the judgment bar. Sadly, though Virginia was popular and respected as an author in her day, the majority of her books had gone out of print well before her death in 1991. Then, in the late 1990s, Signature Books reprinted three of her books, A Little Lower Than the Angels, The Evening and the Morning, and Where Nothing Is Long Ago. But that was in the late 90s. It's been more than 20 years since those reprints, and you have to search dang hard to find even the reprints. And just to let you know, no, I'm not going to tell you that yet. I'll leave you in suspense. You have to spend a lot of money to get any one of these books. Considering how much work it takes to get these novels, I decided to help you out. I'm going to give you my quick top 4 list. Which one should you go for first? Now, it's a difficult choice. Each one of them offers something very different. And depending on your particular journey, you may enjoy one more than the other. But let me make some suggestions. If you want to dive right into a novel that completely understands what it's like to have a faith crisis, start with On This Star. If you want to see Mormonism from a woman's point of view, start with The Evening and the Morning. If you want a sprawling cast of thousands epic that has a little bit of everything, you want A Little Lower Than the Angels. If you want just a straight up, enthralling story that you simply won't be able to put down, Many Heavens is the book for you. But if you want to do something really interesting, do this. Start with On This Star, go to The Evening and the Morning, and then end with Many Heavens. Even though Virginia didn't conceive of them this way, I consider them the most important trilogy in Mormon literature, because through them you can watch as Virginia, with her wide open heart, with her deep empathy, and with her fierce intelligence, struggle to do what so many of us here at Sunstone are trying to do, namely, grow our souls after a faith crisis. You know, kind of like the hero of any Campbellian story. We're trying to become a whole person after having half of us sawed away, which eventually means creating a method of reconnecting with our community. So, according to Virginia Sorensen's novels, this process is a long and arduous one. So, in On This Star, Eric makes some interesting progress, but it ends very badly. In The Evening and the Morning, Kate makes still more progress, but she still has a long way to go at the end. But through Neil's character in Many Heavens, Sorensen finally offers us a view of a returning character, how they can become whole, both in and of themselves, and also reconnect with their communities as a whole person and make their community a more whole place. And the interesting thing is, when you get there, it looks nothing like you think it will. You will be so surprised by the end of Many Heavens. I have not given away the ending because it's kind of astonishing. So this trilogy, it shows us that our faith crisis started us building something that we could not imagine, and that everyone will be surprised when we finish it, especially us. So on the one hand, I hope that I have persuaded you this day that you really want to read Virginia Sorensen's novels. On the other hand, I have to apologize in advance that they will be so hard to find. In a way, I've started you on quite a difficult quest. You may not find these books, even with the help of the internet. In my particular search, of the major libraries in Utah and Idaho, I couldn't find copies of On This Star or Many Heavens. Probably you will find copies of her Newbery Award-winning children's book, Miracles on Maple Hill, and also Plain Girl, as those are her only novels that are still in print. There are some copies of Many Heavens and On This Star in various university libraries in Utah, but of course you have to have access to them. The Evening and the Morning is a little easier to find in libraries, but not in online bookstores, unless you're willing to spend at least $100. I think some of them were actually $400 for the reprint. Anyway, good luck, my friends. May you find these treasures, and may they nourish your soul the same way that they nourished mine. That's the end of the presentation. Remember to type in your questions into Whova, and I will get back to you. And maybe we'll have a fun conversation about Virginia Sorensen. And I've only temporarily unchained these from the bookshelf, so if you want to read them, you'll have to come and sit next to the bookshelf. And I give you rubber gloves that you need to use to handle these. And you also need to rent them out from me by the hour. So let me know if you'd like that. Okay, I'm done.